Hey there, friends. If you have a story you'd like to hear featured on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And of course, and always, thank you. I wanted to share something that actually happened to me just this past year. It still gives me shivers thinking about it, but after talking to my friends and girlfriend about it, I decided I should share with you since you provide me with such great content too. I'm currently living in Texas due to work. I've been here for about a year, and I'll be here for another 2 months at least. Sorry to say, I am not a fan. I do not do well in the heat, so if I'm not at work, I was usually lounging around at home or using the pool at the local gym during the summer. At least I have my girlfriend here with me to help keep me in a better mindset. However, during this event, my girlfriend went back to Oregon to see her family, and of course, I was alone that night and having trouble sleeping, so I wanted to try to just go on a walk, hoping to just wear myself out. However, to my surprise, it was a lot cooler than I was expecting, so it immediately made my mood turn around. It was refreshing. I put in my earbuds and started on the sidewalk that lined our quiet suburban neighborhood. I continued walking down the block, and I wanted to really take advantage of the cool air, so I rounded the corner and thought I would walk around the new cul-de-sac they were developing. They had the foundation laid for 3 houses and the walls on one, but that was about it. But going around the back of the houses, there was a walking trail that looked recently repaved. Made sense enough with the new houses being built. I took the new path, expecting to go through the trees and get a serene view. I could hear the crickets chirping over my music. I only had one bud in, but there were so many and it was pretty loud. The moon was shining bright right above the trees, giving the only light source back there. I was just taking in the unusual but welcoming night until I started getting this weird feeling in my gut. It was the same feeling you get when someone is watching you, or when you know someone is looking over your shoulder. I took out my earbud, stopped where I was, and looked around to see if I could spot someone or something looking at me. I didn't immediately see anything, so I continued to walk with my guard up just in case. As I continued forward, I was watching the trees, noticing the imperfections in the trunks when I saw what I thought was a twisted trunk until it moved. This stopped me in my tracks. I started staring at the shadow, squinting and straining my eyes to make out what exactly I was looking at. The moonlight was working in this thing's favor as all I could see was a dark shadow. As I stared at it, the earlier feeling I experienced was now more intense, making me feel pretty uneasy. My first thought was that maybe I walked in on something I shouldn't have. Maybe they were going to try and rob me. Or maybe it's just someone doing the same thing as me and I startled them. I thought the best thing to do was to acknowledge their existence, so if they were planning on something bad, maybe they would think twice if they knew I knew they were there. So I simply said, "Good evening." When the figure didn't respond, it made me feel even more on edge. I was no longer feeling comfortable walking any closer to them, let alone past them, so I took a few steps backwards, ready to turn back. However, something was telling me to not turn my back to this thing. I pulled out my phone, ready to turn on the flashlight and hopefully a video, just in case something happened. But before I could, the shadow finally moved. The movement was unnatural. It was choppy, almost like I was watching a skipping video, as this thing reached its hands straight up towards a tree. As I watched its arms, I could see this thing had claw-like fingers at the end of their hands. It seemed to turn towards the tree, letting me see what I think was the side profile and its spine, which looked twisted. But one thing I didn't notice until it started moving was the stench. It started as just a sickly, sweet odor reminiscent of decaying leaves, but that quickly turned into a putrid smell of sulfur. The smell quickly found its way down my throat, making me gag. Between this weird, unnatural smell and this inhuman creature in front of me, I was now shrouded in this sense of dread, and I told myself I needed to get the hell out of there. I started walking backwards as fast as I could until I saw the creature seemingly climb up the tree on all fours. It looked like a cat climbing up a tree. My fight or flight instincts finally kicked in full force, and I ran. I kept looking back to make sure nothing came up behind me, and thankfully, nothing ever did. I got out of the trees and was now back in front of the cul-de-sac. The smell was gone, but with my senses now elevated, I noticed I could no longer hear a single cricket. I could hear them across my whole walk, but now the air was still and silent. That made me feel like I still wasn't safe. So I quickly walked home, looking in every direction the whole way. When I finally stumbled onto my front porch, I quickly went inside, locking all the doors and turning all the lights on. I don't want to be in the dark alone anymore. That walk was supposed to help me sleep, and now I was wide awake with no chance of sleeping. Once it was early enough, I called my girlfriend and told her what I had seen. She was worried, but thankful I made it back home in one piece, but we both agreed to not go back there alone, and definitely not at night. What I saw, smelled, and heard is still very vivid in my mind and gives me chills thinking about it. I've always loved listening to cryptids and creature stories, but I never wanted to experience one. I have no idea what that thing was, and part of me wishes I would have went through and taken pictures or a video, but at the same time, I fear what could have happened if I stuck around any longer. I want to start this story off with just a little bit of context. I am a 32-year-old man, and I have two sons aged 10 and 12. Unfortunately, it didn't work out with their mother, so I don't get to see them as much as I want to. But when I do see them, I make it a point to plan something big. A few years ago, because of the whole COVID situation, there was no way I was going to plan an event with the boys at any place that was indoors. So I decided that when summer break rolled around, I would book a camping trip and the three of us would spend some time out in the wilderness. When I was a kid, camping was pretty much the only bonding time I got with my father. He was a very distant and emotionless man, and I wanted to pass down some of the knowledge that he passed on to me about nature. Plus, what preteen boy doesn't like camping? The trip was planned for mid-June, not too long after they got out of school. We live in the northern central US, so the summers aren't terrible, and I was banking on it being decent weather the whole time. The trip that I had booked was supposed to be 8 days total, which I figured was enough to get the basics in, enjoy the view, give them some knowledge, and honestly, just have a good time. The camping ground that I had booked was gorgeous. It surrounded a couple lakes, and there was a storm shelter less than 10 minutes up the road just in case. When I told them about what we were going to do, they were psyched. Their mother, not so much, but it wasn't about her. It was about me spending quality time with my boys. We got there and it was perfect weather. The sun was out, it was slightly overcast, but it didn't look like it was going to rain anytime soon. The spot that I had chosen was great. It was a short walk from the lake, and my youngest immediately asked if we could swim in it. I agreed, so we all got into our swimming trunks and headed down. When we got back was when the first weird event occurred. My truck driver's side door was open. I was a bit annoyed with myself for forgetting to lock it, but to my surprise, nothing was missing. At least, not that I could tell. I shrugged it off as a possible thief that maybe had realized there was nothing of value in the cab and they just gave up. That night, as the boys were sleeping in their tents and I was lying in the bed of my truck in a sleeping bag, which was good enough for me, I was staring up at the sky and I started hearing what sounded like soft breathing or whispering. At first, I thought it was them waking up and talking to each other about something, and I didn't want to disturb them, but when I started focusing on it, I could tell that it wasn't them. The voice that was whispering or breathing or whatever was definitely feminine. I sat up and looked out into the tree line to see if I could see someone out there, but I didn't see a thing. I swear, I sat there for around 10 minutes just scanning the horizon and each tree in between to see if there was something out there, but came up empty. After a few moments, the sound stopped. I'm not going to lie, my paternal instinct was definitely kicking in. But at the same time, I was kind of freaking out. It's not every night you hear a weird woman's voice whispering to you in the woods. Except it was every night. At least every night that we were there. I asked the boys after the second night if they had heard it, but they told me that they didn't. I kind of tried to play it off as if I was trying to scare them, like it was a prank or something, but inside, I was confused as hell. Was I losing it? Or was I just hearing things out in the wilderness? That night, which was the third night of our 8-day trip, I decided I would stay up later and see if I still heard it, or see if it was just my brain messing with me in a half-asleep state. Sure enough, I did. I was sitting there in the bed of the truck, just listening, and through the silence, I started hearing whispering and breathing coming from somewhere. Then, it got worse. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out into the trees, trying to see if there was some kind of animal making the noise, and I saw something. I have no idea what it was, but it looked human-like. It was almost like a person, but the limbs were too long, and the hair on its head was stringy and black. I immediately grabbed my gun and jumped out of the bed, stupidly planning to run at this thing, but by the time my feet hit the ground, it was gone. I just stood there, dumbfounded and scared as hell. Honestly, that was the worst of it, and there wasn't really much more that happened. I didn't really sleep after that, but I convinced the boys to sleep in the cabin of the truck instead of their tents. I pretty much sat in the bed and dozed off slightly each night for 10 or so minutes at most. I think the boys knew something was wrong, but I didn't tell them about it because I didn't want to scare them away from the trip. I didn't even hear the whispering after that, but I still struggled to sleep because part of my mind was telling me that this thing was going to come back, and it was going to have malicious intent. I'm grateful it didn't. We finished out the camping trip and headed home, and while it's only been a few years, I don't really think we're going to be going camping again anytime soon. I was a park ranger for many years at a local park in my town. It was a decent size with plenty to offer. It had 2 different playground areas for the smaller kids. There was a decent-sized walking and biking path that went back into the trees and circled around the entire park, and it also had a back entrance that split off to follow along the road. In the back in the trees, there was also a secluded gazebo area that people had parties at too. Then there was a small water park and skate park on the other side of the path. There always seemed to be something going on there year-round, which I didn't mind. I loved being outside. I loved my job, so I loved just patrolling the area or helping out when someone called us for something. However, it wasn't always a happy job. I also got sent to check on or clean up some bad situations. Most of the time, it was people being disruptive, like drinking or being loud or inconsiderate to others, people trashing an area, like at the gazebo in the back, and leaving their mess, breaking up fights, things like that. But there were a few situations that stuck with me and I never really got answers for. This was one of the weirdest ones for me. So back by the gazebo was an open grassy area that we tended to have schools or scouts camping in. There was a place where you could barbecue, but they usually got permits to do a campfire, I assume to learn how to start fires or stuff like that. When we had groups like this, we typically had one ranger staying overnight in the area to make sure everyone is safe and also not doing things they're not supposed to. I had done this a few times and I loved it because I got to hang out in the park all night, sleep under the stars, and typically got free food. So I was going to be staying one night since a group of Girl Scouts or something of the sort was going to be there. I, of course, drove there, but then all I had with me for the night was my backpack that had some of the things I would take with me when I was camping, such as my ID to prove I was a park ranger and this fold-up cot I had. I like to literally sleep under the stars. No tent, no canopy, just me and a cot, and I was perfect. So I did my rounds and answered questions any of the adults had, helped lead them to the restrooms, and then they all got ready for bed and headed to their tents. I did another round just to make sure everyone else was gone and that nothing was wrong, and then went and laid on my cot. It usually takes a while for me to fall asleep though, so I laid there for a while reading before I finally started getting drowsy. As I went to put my book back in my bag and turn off my headlamp, I heard crunching like someone was walking. I immediately looked around to see if someone was getting out of their tent and didn't see anyone. I turned my lamp back on and started looking at all the tents, but again, I didn't see anyone getting out or any movement from them. So I started looking around the trees to see if there was someone around that shouldn't be, or possibly even wildlife. We had the occasional deers or raccoon that may go through, so I was thinking that's probably what it was. But then, my eyes met with someone standing in the trees. There's a pretty thick area of trees that separates the front of the park from this back park, so it would be weird for anyone to be walking through them. Not to mention, when I did my walk around, there was no sign of anyone around and not even any extra cars in the parking lot. There was no reason for people to be here as we were long closed, so I just sat and watched for a moment to see what they would do. They had to know that I was staring at them, with my light facing right at them, but still, they didn't budge. As I watched this guy though, my eyes started to focus more in the dark and I realized a couple things. One, this guy was huge. I was comparing him to the trees and his height was daunting. He had to be 7 or 8 feet tall, but maybe it was just because I was tired? But other than that, just looking freakishly tall, I thought he was wearing a big fur coat. He just looked very furry. The problem I had with this, though, was it was around August, I believe. So it was way too hot to be wearing a fur coat. I didn't want to alarm any of the kids, so I stood up and thought I'd walk over there to see if they were okay and ask them to just leave if so. But as I stood up, the guy backed up slowly and started walking away. That's when I noticed it wasn't a coat that he was wearing. This guy, or thing, was covered in fur. His legs, arms, everywhere. I started getting closer to the trees when this thing took off the opposite direction, but they did it on all 4. He was standing and walking on 2 legs, but then ran off on all 4, and it seemed so fluid, like an animal, not a human. I'm not going to lie though, I was not brave enough to follow this thing, but was also not wanting to wake up the campers. I didn't want to scare the kids and look like this psycho, so I walked along the outside of the trees, scared this thing was going to jump out at me, but didn't see it again. I called out to someone that was on call and asked if they knew of anything going on or anyone that was supposed to be here, and he said no. I told them I saw something in the trees, and he immediately just dismissed it as a deer or something. So I tried to snap out of it and headed back to my cot and laid there. Unfortunately, at that point though, every little sound would catch my attention. When the wind blew and moved a branch, I would look over at it. I would look around if I heard a car driving by. Anytime the girls shifted in the tents, I would jump up. So, needless to say, I didn't sleep very well that night. Thankfully, the girls were young enough that they woke up pretty early, so I wasn't alone anymore. Some of the adults noticed I looked off and asked if I was okay, and I just said I didn't sleep well and didn't mention anything else about it. I did tell my friend that worked there too, because what happened and what I saw, of course, he was adamant I saw Bigfoot. I live in a state that is known for its sightings, and that's all I will say about my location, but I never believed in that stuff before, but now I'm not so sure. I don't know how else to explain away what I saw. Either way, I never saw it again while I worked there, thankfully, but you can bet I was better prepared for future overnight stays. A few years ago, a couple of old military buddies of mine and I decided we wanted to go take a road trip around some seemingly random places here in the good old US of A. The 3 of us knew each other way back in grade school, and we all grew up together, which eventually led us to all joining the Army. 2 of us got deployed, myself and James, but Ricky ended up with an honorable discharge because of a medical issue. He ended up being diagnosed with a heart condition that caused problems with the muscle, and they determined that he wouldn't have been able to have been sent overseas. Not really relevant, but it helps to show that we all knew each other really well, and we all trusted each other. We had all been home for a few years, and we were pretty much told that we were back permanently, barring any craziness where we would be called in. Because we were finally back home and not likely to be called out, we wanted to take a road trip out to some of the open parts of the country, like the national parks down in Utah. Our plan was to head east through Nevada and then into Utah to go see canyons out there and head to Bryce and Zion National Parks. I don't remember why we wanted to go to these routes, but the three of us agreed that we weren't getting any younger and that now was the time to see the sights that this part of the country had to offer. Because it was early spring and wasn't getting too terribly hot yet, we decided that we would make it a point to camp out either in the open or spend nights sleeping in the car when necessary. Ricky had a decent-sized van that had more than enough space for all of us to push the seats back and sleep, while one slept in the back seat. We packed up all of our things, made sure we had enough cash to get gas and any supplies, and the three of us headed out onto the road with nothing more than a basic sense of, let's drive east until we get too tired to drive anymore, and then enjoy the great outdoors. This plan worked for most of the first day. We took turns driving for a few hours, trying to spread it out among the three of us as much as we could, but also making sure that we weren't too tired. We planned on taking I-80 most of the way, but also decided that we would take a small detour in Utah to head down 196 toward the Dugway military base. None of us had ever been there, but I wanted to see the area for really no reason. Plus, from there, we could just head south for a few hours to hit the areas for Bryce and Zion National Park. Now, I'm not stupid. I know that even with a military background, you don't just drive to a military base, and you sure as hell don't camp anywhere near the ground that isn't a designated camping area. So, after we got to the area, we made a trip out to a small campground about 30 or so minutes to the northwest, and we made plans to stay there for the night. The night that we got there was absolutely beautiful, so we opted to pull the tents out and spend the evening outside under the stars. We got the camp set up right next to where we parked the van and had a small fire going as it was getting a bit chilly. We spent the entire night just chatting about random things that we wanted to do now that we were home, and just having a nice evening as three friends out in the middle of nowhere. A couple hours later, right before we were about to call it a night, we were all just sitting there and heard what sounded like a weird screaming. We all kind of stopped and looked around the area to see if we could see anything, but I think we all quickly went to the same conclusion: coyotes. We'd all heard them before, and the sound was pretty close to what we knew to be coyotes, so we moved on from there and decided that it wasn't a huge deal. We just needed to keep an eye out for them if they got closer. We all decided to call it a night and head to sleep, thinking we could just get through the creepy sounds they were making if we passed out. We all started getting in our tents, and that was when it went from probably coyotes to what the hell is out there. The screaming changed in pitch from the high screech to a low tone, and then it started to shift into what sounded like legitimate laughter. We tried to justify it as just being an animal, but it almost sounded like this thing was a person laughing in an almost cartoonishly evil way, if that makes sense. It would laugh, slowly change into the high-pitched screech, and then shift back to the laughing. We decided that it wasn't worth sleeping outside, and that we would just pack our stuff and head to a nearby hotel or parking lot to spend the rest of the night. We shoved our tents and everything else back into the van in record time, and within 10 minutes, we're back on the road. We got back in the car, Ricky started the van up and hit the headlights, and we could see something standing out behind a large rock, probably 40 or so feet away. I couldn't really make out a shape of what this thing was, but it was bipedal, and it was watching us. The other guy said that it looked kind of human, but something about it was off. Like it was a human mixed with something. I remember it had a person-like shape, but the face that I saw wasn't that of a person. It was a creature. After a few seconds of us staring at this thing, and it staring back at us, Ricky hit the high beams and it reacted to them by pulling itself behind the rock. We decided that we did not want to know, nor need to know, what the hell this thing was. We gunned it back onto the road and decided to just get back to heading south and stop at the first sign of civilization. The three of us didn't say a word about the thing the entire time we were on the road that night. I think we were all trying to come up with a logical explanation for what that thing was. We didn't have any other encounters or anything like that, and we pressed on with the road trip as normal after that. We've only spoken about this thing once or twice since, and I think we all want to say that this thing was an escaped military experiment because we were close to the base. But we also don't want to think about that possibility. I have no idea if it was just some freak animal out there or if it was a cryptid of some sort, but I know I will never forget about it. So that, my friends, was another collection of cryptid stories. One of the topics that I love to read, narrate, watch, or listen to. But like that one person said in my story, just listen to it. I am good with not experiencing it. Yep, that's it for me. It's always the things that go along with it that make it even more terrifying. Like, it's not that you just saw this giant beast walking around you and a bunch of kids, right? It's not just, yeah, that was pretty creepy that thing just climbed up the tree. Definitely would be terrified of those things. But the fact that there's the smells or that everything else gets quiet around you, absolutely not. I'm already crying. Sorry, not dealing with that. So I'll just stay right here and we'll just continue to listen to them and feel sorry for those that had to experience it. So yeah, if you did enjoy this video, then I have a couple things you can do to tell me about it. You can start by liking the video. The little thumbs up will light up, which looks neat. You can also subscribe if you haven't already, which is double neat because then you can hear more stories like this that you can also like. And you can also tell me in however many words YouTube will allow in the comments below, whether that's 1 word or 100 words. I don't know how many words you're allowed in comments. Either way, you can do that, or you can just leave me some emojis. I'm cool with that too. You can also let me know if you like cryptids, if you have a favorite. Do you have one that's unique or commonly talked about in your state or country? All optional words you can leave in the comments for me. So with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic day and a wonderful rest of your week. And until next time, take care.